So some, young whiz-bang genius of Michelle's team said, I've heard of this fancy new device called a personal computer. I swear I've seen a couple of them in our teachers' classrooms even. So why don't, at the 3 schools we're going to use in this pilot, why don't we give teachers, make sure they have a classroom computer, let them take attendance on the computer, and then upload it to the system. We could have parents able to know whether their child was in school that day by lunchtime. Unexpected problem. Turns out that the Washington Teacher Union contract stipulates that requiring teachers to take attendance is a permissible job duty. But it is impermissible for the chancellor to require teachers to do data entry. It took them 8 or 10 weeks of negotiations to work out a memoranda of understanding, waiving the data entry provision for 3 schools in a district that runs 130-odd. This is called being stuck. If you are a school leader or a system leader or a deputy superintendent for instruction, and each and every time you've got an idea to solve a problem, you have to run through these kinds of channels, through policies and practices and contracts and embedded ways of doing, sooner or later you burn yourself to a crisp. So to me, that's the issue. And the thing here is this is where we get stuck when we are always talking about schooling and our passion and our commitment to the kids, that this is not an unusual problem, it turns out. It's not an unusual problem, right? We're all co-owners in General Motors. You've probably seen the ads which tell us that they've fully repaid the money, which is actually not true. They got a new federal loan under clean tech to repay their old federal loan, and then we still own $40 billion in shares. But that's another matter. But General Motors is actually a terrific example of what I'm talking about. General Motors, the things that got them in trouble, the overextended dealer network, 5,800 dealers across the country, too many models, too many different chassis lines, these huge and unaffordable benefits. These were once the exact reasons that General Motors was considered a success. Right? It's not like these were always maladies. In 1958, when the UAW negotiated the Treaty of Detroit with the Big Three, this job bank with 95% pay, whether or not you show up, that was considered far-sighted. You've got all these 18-year-olds who come in, they're going to work this job for 40 years. Let's make sure they don't drift off. We're just going to take care of them when times are a little slow. Those wonderful benefit packages that locked people in, made them loyal to the companies. That overextended dealer network, that was once in a day before the web, was how everybody bought their cars. And having lots of dealers out there meant you had lots of roots in the communities, which gave you lots of juice in state legislatures. So all of these things that we now say, oh, they're a problem. They weren't a problem. What happened, though, is the world changed. The model that you wanted to use needed to change in accordance. But what happened to GM, just like so many other folks like TWA and Pan Am and Bethlehem Steel, and I'm in Ohio, you guys have your own litany of folks who have gone through this, is even when you know what to do, when you know the best practices, sometimes you just can't do them in certain kinds of organizations. Because if you're the CEO, the fights you've got to go through to try to trim your dealer network, those same political roots that were once so useful, now working against you. You talk about trying to trim dealers, and now you've got state legislators calling you and telling you they're going to give you a headache. That same pension and benefit system that once kept your people tied to you now makes your product unaffordable. TWA and Pan Am in the 1960s and 70s, they had all the best pilots. They had all the best gates. They had all those really lucrative, pricey routes when only 20% of Americans had ever been in an airplane, and everything was business travel. Once you get after 1975, when we start to deregulate the air, suddenly a lot of us people who couldn't once afford to fly and didn't necessarily have all this need for luxury on our nonstop from Cleveland to Maui, suddenly we're happy to fly 2 or 3 stopovers. And what we want is somebody's going to give us a cheap bargain, and they're going to pack the seats in, and they're going to give us peanuts instead of big meals, but we're just shopping on price. So it wasn't that TWA and Pan Am didn't have smart people. It wasn't they didn't have the practices. It was that when the rules started to change, all the money they had vested in buying those gates and in hiring these top dog pilots and in these fancy steward systems, suddenly this was a drag instead of a boon. Schooling is no different. The difference in schooling is that Claire Brown and a couple of colleagues of hers did this terrific book for UChicago 3 years ago now, called Economic Turbulence. And they pointed out that the average lifespan of a Fortune 500 company from inception to dissolution is 50 years. 50 years. You go back and you look at America's 25 biggest companies today and 40 years ago, 3/4 of our biggest companies today didn't exist in 1965. The world rotates. It's a rotation of crops. We don't even think about this most of the time. It's just the way the world works. But in education, you go back 50 years, every single school district in Ohio today existed 50 years ago. Every single one, either in its current incarnation or as a consolidation of a couple of districts, it did exist 50 years ago. So whereas these other guys, JetBlue gets to come in, wipe the slate clean. Toyota gets to come in, wipe the slate clean. Start off with new contracts, with new rules, hire talent in a new way. We don't get to do that in education because we keep trying to revamp and overturn these existing systems. And it's not that education leaders are any worse at this than anybody else. It's that most people in most walks of life can't do this. Turnarounds have become very exciting in education of late, and I have absolutely zero confidence, absolutely no doubt that we can turn around some schools some of the time. But we've been studying this in the business literature, of course, for 30 years. Total quality management, corporate reengineering. If you're batting 300 with these things, if these things work 3 out of 10 times, that's considered pretty good. And that's when you can hire at will, fire at will, and do what you need to do. So if this resonates at all, what does it mean? Well, for me, what it means is the key is that all of our talk about trying to figure out what the best practices are and make districts do them is actually unlikely to get us where we need to get. Our schools were not built for the purposes for the purposes we're asking them to serve. When American schooling was built out, say from Horace Mann's tenure on the Massachusetts School Board starting in 1837 through the end of the Progressive Era in 1930, that was when we had this explosion of schooling in this country. We used the tools that made sense at the time. We used the tools that made sense. If you wanted to offer education on the prairie or in New York City and Cleveland and Boston in 1850, you just didn't have that many educated adults. And you had no other way to get kids in front of an educator than to build a box, put an educator in each classroom, and pack kids in there. It was a perfectly elegant solution to the challenge. Now, this was never expected to teach all kids well. Remember, a century ago, only 1 American in 10 finished high school. This notion of excellence for all was nonsense. It didn't exist. It's the notion that we're going to serve all kids well is less than a generation and a half old. We had our first compulsory education law in the U.S. in the 1640s. We didn't get 90% of kids showing up at school each day until the 1960s. It took us 3 centuries and change just to get kids to show up regularly. As soon as we built that out, we said, well, that's not the game anymore. We want schools to excel. Why would we be surprised that the schools we built aren't particularly well suited to what we're asking them to do? It doesn't make sense to vilify superintendents and teachers. It makes sense to say, how do we put them in situations where they can succeed? We've got a teaching model which we feminize the teaching profession by choice. 1810, 75% of our nation's teachers were men. Going back 2 millennia, teaching had been a male profession. It was what men did on an itinerant basis on their way to other real professions. In order to get the bodies to staff the schools that we were building out during the Common School era, we redefined teaching to make it part of the domestic sphere, so we would feel okay about women doing it. This is where ed schools came from. First normal schools were launched in the 1820s to teach these women who were going to be outside the home the norms that they would need so that they could be okay role models around children. Well, we built this profession, and what happened was as late as the 1950s, 55% of college-educated women were becoming teachers. Well, we don't have to worry about compensation schedules. We don't have to worry about being competitive. We don't have to worry about making an attractive career because they weren't going to go anywhere else. The doors were shut to them.